The morning of March 5th, 1953, broke with a heavy, suffocating grey over the Baltic coast of Poland. Inside the Soviet satellite state, the atmosphere was already thick, with a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. In Moscow, the man who had orchestrated the Iron Curtain, Joseph Stalin, was in his final hours. The entire Eastern Bloc was holding its breath, paralyzed by the uncertainty of a looming power vacuum. The Soviet military machine was on its highest state of alert, paranoid and twitching at shadows. At the Redzikowo Air Base near Slupsk, just a few miles from the Baltic Sea, the ground crews were busy preparing the pride of the Warsaw Pact's air forces. The aircraft sitting on the tarmac were not old relics of the Second World War. They were the future. They were the MiG-15, his aircraft. To the Western world, this machine was a phantom, a terrifying silhouette that had appeared over the skies of Korea 3 years prior and shattered the illusion of American air superiority. The MiG-15 was faster, climbed higher, and hit harder than anything the United States Air Force could initially field. For years, American intelligence had been desperate to get their hands on one. They had offered money, asylum, and freedom, launching Operation Moolah to bribe a pilot to defect. They needed to see under the skin of the beast that was tearing their B-29 bombers apart. But the Soviet security apparatus was hermetic. The pilots chosen to fly these machines were vetted, watched, and indoctrinated. The secret was safe. Or so the Kremlin believed. On this particular morning, a flight of 4 MiG-15 aircraft taxied onto the runway. Leading the formation was a seasoned instructor. On his wing was a 21-year-old lieutenant named Franciszek Jarecki. Jarecki was the poster child of the new communist Poland. He was young, fiercely intelligent, and a graduate of the prestigious Eaglets Aviation Academy. He had been scrutinized by the secret police, the Informacja Wojskowa, and deemed politically reliable. He was a member of the party. He was trusted with the state's most valuable secret weapon. The engines roared to life, the centrifugal flow turbojets screaming with a distinctive high-pitched whine that shattered the morning silence. The 4 silver arrows thundered down the runway and lifted into the overcast sky, banking towards the Baltic Sea for a routine patrol. From the control tower, Soviet liaison officers and Polish commanders watched the blips on the radar screen. It was a standard exercise. The formation was tight. They were flying parallel to the coast, a show of force, a reminder that the airspace behind the Iron Curtain was inviolable. And then, the impossible happened. At an altitude of 6,000 meters, without a single radio transmission, the second blip on the radar screen, Lieutenant Jarecki, simply vanished. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden histories and high-stakes mysteries of the Cold War, make sure you are subscribed to Cold War Impact. We investigate the stories the history books often leave out. The initial reaction in the control tower was not suspicion, it was confusion, quickly followed by a cold dread. In the high-stakes world of early jet aviation, a disappearing radar blip usually meant only one thing: catastrophic structural failure. Formation leader, report status of Wingman 2. The tower crackled. The response from the flight leader was hesitant, laced with genuine bewilderment. Tower, I have lost visual. He is gone. He just dropped. The Soviet liaison officers exchanged glances. The MiG-15 was a robust machine, but it was not without its flaws. Had the engine seized? Had the young lieutenant suffered hypoxia? The radar operators frantically adjusted their gain, sweeping the sector where Jarecki had last been seen. Nothing. Just the empty, static-filled return of the Baltic Sea. But within seconds, the confusion morphed into panic. This was the morning of March 5th. Stalin was dying. The West was watching. If a Soviet-built aircraft had crashed into the sea, it was a tragedy. But if something else was happening, it was a catastrophe. The flight leader's voice came back over the radio, pitched higher now. I see no splash, no fire. He is just gone. On the ground, the gears of the Soviet military machine began to grind with terrifying friction. Phones rang in bunkers. The Informacja Wojskowa officers were summoned to the operations room. The possibility of a crash was still the leading theory, but a darker, more terrifying thought began to creep into the minds of the commanders. What if he hadn't crashed? The radar operators widened their scope. They looked for a low-level signature, something skimming the waves. The physics of radar in 1953 were well understood. The curvature of the Earth created a blind spot, a radar horizon. If a pilot was skilled enough, or reckless enough, to fly mere meters above the water, he could disappear from the screens of the ground control interception radars. But that was a suicidal maneuver in a jet moving at nearly 1,000 kilometers per hour. Then, a remote coastal observation post called in a report. They had seen something, a silver flash. A shockwave that rattled the windows of the coastal watchtower. It wasn't a plane falling from the sky. It was a plane under power, full power. The report hit the command center like a physical blow. The missing MiG-15 was not dead in the water. It was flying, and it was not flying back to base. The trajectory was wrong. The aircraft had jettisoned its external fuel tanks. The observers had seen them tumble into the sea to reduce drag and weight. This was not a training error. This was a combat configuration. The pilot was lightening his load for maximum speed and maneuverability. He was heading northwest. The realization sparked absolute pandemonium. Northwest did not lead to any Warsaw-Pact airfield. Northwest led across the open water of the Baltic, and beyond that water lay the island of Bornholm. Bornholm belonged to Denmark. Denmark was a founding member of NATO. The blood drained from the faces of the Soviet officers. This was the nightmare scenario. It wasn't just a defection. It was the potential delivery of the Soviet Union's most guarded technological crown jewel directly into the lap of American intelligence. The MiG-15 contained avionics, engine metallurgy, and weapon systems that the West had been trying to reverse engineer for 3 years. Scramble everything, the order came down. It wasn't a request. It was a scream of desperation. Within minutes, the air raid sirens at Redzikowo and neighboring bases were wailing. 4 more MiG-15 aircraft were taxied onto the runway, their afterburners lighting up the grey morning. But this time, they were not launching for a drill. They were launching with live ammunition. Their orders were explicit and horrifyingly simple. Find the renegade. Shoot him down. The pilots strapping into their cockpits were Jarecki's friends. They ate with him, drank with him, but the Soviet system did not allow for sentimentality. If Jarecki crossed that line, he was no longer a comrade. He was a target. But the Soviets were already minutes behind. Jarecki had seized the element of surprise. He had used the cloud cover and the confusion to build a lead. The mystery for the Soviet commanders was no longer, where is he? But can we catch him? They stared at the radar screens, praying for a blip to reappear so they could vector the interceptors. They needed him to make a mistake. They needed him to pop up. What they didn't know was that Jarecki was flying with the kind of manic precision that comes from the fear of death. He was skimming the whitecaps of the Baltic, flying so low that the spray from the sea was misting his windshield. He was invisible to their radar, a ghost running for the edge of the world. The stakes could not have been higher. If he made it, the balance of air power in the Cold War would shift overnight. The shroud of mystery surrounding the Soviet superplane would be ripped away. If he failed, he would be a fireball in the ocean, another statistic of the Iron Curtain. Back at the base, the political officers were already sealing Jarecki's quarters. They were tearing apart his bunk, looking for notes, for signs of Western corruption, for anything to explain the betrayal. They found nothing. No letters. No manifestos. Just the empty bed of a man who had woken up that morning and decided to steal the fastest thing on Earth. The Soviet interceptors roared into the sky, their pilots scanning the grey horizon. But the Baltic was vast, and a low-flying jet is a needle in a haystack. The mystery had now shifted from a tactical confusion to a terrifying strategic race. The clock was ticking. Every second the silver MiG stayed in the air was a second closer to NATO territory. The Soviet commanders gripped their handsets, waiting for the kill confirmation that would save their careers and perhaps their lives. But the radio remained silent. The ghost was loose. The sky over the Baltic Sea remained an impenetrable slate of grey, indifferent to the panic unfolding beneath it. The 4 MiG-15 aircraft that had been scrambled from Redzikowo were now screaming through the air at nearly sound barrier speeds, their pilots pushing the throttles past the military power detents. They were burning fuel at a catastrophic rate, their eyes straining against the monotony of the whitecaps below. The command from the ground was relentless. Search Sector 4. Search Sector 5. Report contact. But there was no contact. The physics of the hunt were working against the pursuers. Lieutenant Jarecki had not just flown away, he had exploited the very architecture of the Cold War's surveillance blind spots. By hugging the waves, flying at an altitude of fewer than 50 meters, he had slipped beneath the radar lobes of the Soviet tracking stations. The interceptors were looking for a target in the sky, but Jarecki had become a part of the seascape. Back at the airbase, the initial frenzy of the scramble had curdled into a cold, terrifying procedural paralysis. The base commander ordered a total lockdown. The gates were sealed. The telephone lines were cut to prevent unauthorized leaks. Every pilot, mechanic, and fuel truck driver who had been on the tarmac that morning was rounded up and herded into the briefing rooms. The Informacja Wojskowa, the ruthless military counterintelligence agency modeled directly on the Soviet Smersh, took control of the investigation within the hour. Their officers, dressed in the distinct uniforms that inspired dread in every Polish soldier, swept through the barracks like a plague. They were not looking for technical faults anymore. They were looking for the rot of treason. Jarecki's room was dismantled with forensic violence. Mattresses were slashed, floorboards were pried up, and personal letters were seized. The investigators were desperate to find a trail, a connection to Western intelligence, a stash of foreign currency, a radio codebook. They needed a narrative that explained this disaster as the work of a sophisticated foreign spy ring. If Jarecki was a super spy, then the failure of the security officers to catch him was perhaps excusable. But if Jarecki was just a 21-year-old kid who had outsmarted the entire Soviet security apparatus on a whim, that was unforgivable. That meant the system itself was flawed. The interrogation of Jarecki's mechanics was brutal. Did he ask for extra fuel? Did he tamper with the radio? Did he look nervous? The mechanics, terrified and stammering, could only offer the truth, which was the most frightening answer of all. Jarecki had been calm. He had been a model pilot. He had joked with them about the bad coffee in the mess hall. He had checked his flaps and his landing gear with the precision of a true professional. There were no signs. The enemy was not a shadowed figure in a trench coat. He was the golden boy of the regiment. While the base was being torn apart from the inside, the search over the Baltic was reaching its desperate conclusion. The interceptors were running on fumes. One by one, they were forced to break off the hunt and return to base, landing with heavy, defeated thuds on the concrete. The pilots climbed out of their cockpits, shaking their heads. "Nothing," they reported. "The sea is empty." This absence of evidence birthed a new, desperate theory in the command bunker. Perhaps Jarecki hadn't defected. Perhaps he hadn't crashed. Perhaps he had been taken. A whisper began to circulate among the high command, a legend born of paranoia. Had the Americans developed a new weapon? A Snatch aircraft capable of intercepting a jet in mid-air? Or perhaps a new electronic warfare device that could hijack the controls of a Soviet plane remotely? It sounded absurd, but in the echo chamber of the Cold War, where the enemy's capabilities were constantly exaggerated to justify budgets and crackdowns, the impossible seemed plausible. General Ivan Terkelson, the Soviet commander overseeing the Polish Air Force, demanded answers. He didn't care about ghosts. He cared about the machine. The MiG-15 his was not just an airplane, it was a state secret, wrapped in aluminum. It housed the Klimov VK-1 engine, a piece of engineering that the Soviets had successfully reverse-engineered from the British Nenni engine and then improved. It possessed a gyroscopic gun sight that allowed for accurate fire at high G-forces. It had specific alloy compositions in its turbine blades that Soviet metallurgists had spent years perfecting. If the Americans got this plane, they wouldn't just learn how to fly it, they would learn how to build it. They would learn the specific tensile strength of Soviet aluminum. They would learn the frequency of the radar warning receivers. They would learn the exact burn temperature of the engine. It was an intelligence hemorrhage of apocalyptic proportions. By the afternoon, the Soviet Navy had been mobilized. Destroyers and fast patrol boats were churning up the water in the area where Jarecki was last seen. They were not looking for a survivor. They were looking for an oil slick. "Find me debris," the orders read. "Find me a piece of the tail. Find me a helmet." Finding wreckage would be the salvation of the Soviet command. If Jarecki was dead at the bottom of the Baltic, the secrets were safe. The water would crush the fuselage and corrode the electronics. A dead defector was a hero. A live defector was a catastrophe. Reports started coming in, fueled by wishful thinking. A patrol boat captain claimed to see an oil sheen. A coastal lookout reported hearing a distant explosion. The investigators clung to these scraps of information, building a wrong conclusion that they could sell to Moscow. They began to draft a preliminary report. Lieutenant Jarecki, likely suffering from spatial disorientation, crashed into the Baltic Sea during a routine maneuver. The aircraft is lost. The pilot is presumed dead. It was a comforting lie. It allowed the commanders to breathe. It allowed the security officers to stop the purges, momentarily. They wanted to believe that the threat was neutralized by the unforgiving sea. But this comforting delusion was shattered by a single, undeniable transmission. It didn't come from a Soviet radio, it came from the West. Monitoring stations in East Germany picked up chatter from the Danish air defense network. The Danes were not reacting to a crash, they were reacting to an arrival. The intercepts were fragmented, but the keywords were unmistakable. Bogey, landing, Bornholm. The blood in the veins of the Soviet commanders turned to ice. Bornholm. The Danish island was a mere stone's throw from the Polish coast, a rugged outpost in the middle of the Baltic. Jarecki hadn't crashed. He hadn't been abducted by aliens or snatched by a secret American weapon. He had simply flown to the nearest piece of NATO concrete and put his wheels down. The investigation phase instantly shifted from a hunt for a missing pilot to a frantic damage control operation. The bogeyman was real. The aircraft was intact. The Soviet reaction was a mixture of fury and impotence. They immediately jammed the radio frequencies, trying to block news of the defection from reaching the Polish public. But the damage was done. The MiG-15, the tangible proof of Soviet air power, was sitting on a Danish runway, likely surrounded by confused local militia and bewildered fishermen. But the true horror for the Kremlin lay in who would be arriving next. The Danes were NATO members, but they were a small player. The real threat was the giant across the Atlantic. The Soviet intelligence chiefs knew exactly what would happen. A telephone would ring in Washington, D.C., a telex would be sent to the headquarters of the United States Air Force in Europe. Men in dark suits and men in flight suits would be boarding transport planes within the hour. The Soviets had spent years building a legend of invincibility around the MiG. They had terrified Western pilots with tales of its speed and its firepower. They had kept it hidden behind barbed wire and censorship. Now, that legend was parked on a damp island, waiting to be poked, prodded, and dissected by the enemy. As the sun set on March 5, 1953, the irony was thick enough to choke on. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin was taking his final breaths, ending an era of terror. And on a small island in the Baltic, a young Polish pilot had just driven a silver stake through the heart of the Soviet military's secrecy. The investigation was over. The nightmare had just begun. While the Kremlin was consumed by a chaotic cocktail of grief for Stalin and rage over the defection, the atmosphere inside the United States Air Force headquarters in Europe was radically different. There was no panic here. There was only the electric, predatory focus of a predator that has just spotted a wounded animal. The telephone call that rang in the office of General Loris Norstad at Wiesbaden Air Base in West Germany did not bring news of a disaster. It brought the opportunity of the decade. "General," the voice on the secure line said, "the package has arrived. It is on the ground in Bornholm. It is intact." For years, the United States had been fighting a ghost. In the skies over MiG Alley in Korea, American F-86 Sabre pilots had battled the MiG-15, trading kills in high-speed dogfights. But the Soviet machine remained an enigma. American engineers argued over its theoretical top speed. Intelligence analysts debated the composition of its alloys. They knew what it could do, but they didn't know how it did it. They lacked the source code of Soviet aviation. The American solution to this problem was not a bigger bomb or a faster missile. It was a secret, highly specialized unit operating within the shadows of the Air Force. The Air Technical Intelligence Center, ATIC, based out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, with forward operating teams in Europe. These men were not standard soldiers. They were engineer spies. They were metallurgists, propulsion experts, and avionics wizards who carried toolkits alongside their sidearms. Their mission was specific and singular: foreign material exploitation. Their job was to take the enemy's nightmares, strip them down to the nuts and bolts, and expose them as mere machines. This was the secret project that would dismantle the Soviet myth. Within hours of Jarecki's wheels touching the Danish grass, the ATIC machinery roared into life. This was not a diplomatic mission. It was a technical heist. The clock was the enemy. The Soviet Union was already exerting massive diplomatic pressure on Denmark to return both the pilot and the plane immediately. The Danes, a small nation caught between superpowers, were stalling, but they couldn't hold out forever. The Americans had a window of perhaps 48 hours. Maybe less. A C-47 transport plane lifted off from a US base in Germany, banking towards Denmark. On board was a team of ATIC specialists. They didn't look like a strike force. They looked like mechanics. But they possessed the knowledge to dismantle a jet aircraft and map its genetic code in the time it took most people to change a tire. When they landed at Rennes Airport on Bornholm, the scene was surreal. The sleek, silver MiG-15 sat parked on the grass, looking alien against the backdrop of the quiet, rural island. Local Danish militia guarded it with rifles, looking nervous. The American team moved with surgical precision. They didn't just walk up to the aircraft, they swarmed it. The first step was the triage. They needed to know if the aircraft was booby-trapped. Soviet doctrine often included destruct mechanisms to prevent exactly this kind of capture. The specialists carefully checked the cockpit, the ejection seat, and the avionics bays. "Clear," the lead engineer signaled. Then, the real work began. This was the ingenuity of the American military-industrial complex in action. They weren't just looking at the plane, they were absorbing it. Photographers snapped thousands of pictures, capturing every rivet, every weld line, every dial in the cockpit. They used high-fidelity film to record the texture of the metal, looking for signs of stress or poor manufacturing. But the prize was the engine. The Klimov VK-1. The team popped the access panels. There it was, the beating heart of the Soviet Air Force. It was a massive centrifugal flow turbojet. The American engineers knew its lineage. It was a copy of the British Rolls-Royce Nenni engine, which the UK had foolishly sold to the Soviets in 1947. But the Soviets had modified it. They had squeezed more thrust out of it. The ATIC team brought out calipers and micrometers. They measured the turbine blades. They scraped samples of the metal to analyze the alloy composition back in the labs in Ohio. They needed to know if the Soviets had solved the creep problem, the tendency of metal to deform under high heat and stress. If the Soviets had better metallurgy, it meant their entire industrial base was more advanced than Washington suspected. As they worked, they began to see the source of the Soviet power. It wasn't magic. It was a brutal, pragmatic approach to engineering. The Americans were used to building Cadillac's planes with finished edges, comfortable cockpits, and redundant safety systems. The MiG-15 was a tractor with wings. The cockpit was cramped and agricultural. The heating system was crude. The instrumentation was sparse. But as the ATIC engineers dug deeper, they realized the genius of this simplicity. The Soviets hadn't built a plane to last 20 years. They had built a plane to fight today. They had cut every corner that didn't contribute to killing the enemy. The ingenuity of the American response was their ability to quantify this threat instantly. They weren't intimidated by the rough welding marks. They measured them, calculated the drag coefficient, and realized that the sloppiness was calculated. While the engineers worked on the hardware, another team of intelligence officers was working on the software, Franciszek Jarecki himself. They whisked the young pilot away to a secure location. Jarecki was a goldmine of a different sort. He didn't just bring the machine, he brought the manual. He knew the tactical doctrines. He knew the morale of the pilots. He knew the radio frequencies. "Why did you leave?" the American debriefers asked. Jarecki told them of the lies, the political indoctrination, the stifling atmosphere of the satellite state. But he also told them something that made the intelligence officers sit up straight. He told them about the limitations. At high speeds, Jarecki explained, sketching on a pad, the stick freezes. You cannot turn. If you dive too fast, you cannot pull out. This was the golden nugget. The pilots in Korea had suspected it, but Jarecki confirmed it. The MiG-15 had a hydraulic flaw. At Mach 0.92, the controls stiffened. The pilot lost authority. The ATIC team on the ground in Denmark was confirming this physically. They traced the hydraulic lines. They measured the control surface ratios. They saw the engineering bottleneck. The mystery was dissolving. The ghost was becoming a machine. But the clock was running out. The Soviet embassy in Copenhagen was screaming. Threats of military action were being veiled but palpable. The Danes insisted the Americans had to finish. "We need to move it," the American lead engineer said. "We can't finish the job here. We need to get it to a secure hangar." Under the cover of darkness, a massive operation was launched to disassemble the MiG-15 partially. The wings were unbolted. The tail was separated. The pieces were loaded onto trucks and moved to a more secure Danish airbase at Varløse, near Copenhagen, where the facilities were better. There, the dissection continued in earnest. The Americans weren't just studying it, they were creating a counter-manual. Every flaw they found became a paragraph in a new training circular for US pilots. Weakness found in the ejection seat mechanism. Blind spot in the rear, visibility confirmed. Engine overheat thresholds identified. The source of American dominance wasn't just that they had better factories, it was that they had an unrivaled capacity to learn. They took the terrifying unknown, broke it down into data points, and distributed that data to every squadron in NATO. By the time the diplomats finally caved and agreed to return the aircraft to Poland, the MiG-15 was no longer a secret weapon. It was a known quantity. The Americans had gutted it of its mystery. They packed it back into crates, looking like a pile of scrap metal, and handed it back to the Soviets. But they kept the knowledge. And that knowledge was about to lead to a revelation that would shock the Western world, not because the MiG was better than they thought, but because of what it revealed about the fragility of the Soviet giant. The physical aircraft was returned to the Polish authorities in late March 1953. It arrived in crates, battered and scarred by the disassembly process. The Soviets took it back with a grim silence. But while they reclaimed the aluminum, they had lost the war. The true confrontation did not happen on the runway at Bornholm. It happened weeks later, in a secure briefing room at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, and simultaneously in the terrified corridors of the Kremlin. For 3 years, the West had been paralyzed by a singular question. How did a nation devastated by war, with a peasant economy, leapfrog American aviation technology? The mystery of the MiG-15 superiority had fueled a Red Scare that suggested Soviet science had unlocked a secret paradigm of propulsion or aerodynamics that the West had missed. The report from the ATIC team shattered that illusion. It was the shock that redefined the Cold War. As the analysts laid out the blueprints and the metallurgical data, the room fell silent. The horrifying truth, horrifying for the Soviet reputation at least, was that there was no secret Soviet super science. There was only theft. The reveal was the engine. When the Americans stripped the Klimov VK-1 down to its core, they didn't find a revolutionary Soviet design. They found a Rolls-Royce Nen. It wasn't just similar, it was a near-perfect, reverse-engineered clone. The British had sold 25 Nenni engines to Moscow in 1947 as a gesture of goodwill, under the naive assumption they would be used for commercial transport. Stalin had handed them to his engineers with a simple order: copy it, do not change a single screw. The shock went deeper. The ATIC report revealed that while the design was stolen, the manufacturing was terrifyingly crude. The superplane that had terrified the West was, in the words of one engineer, an agricultural product. The skin of the aircraft was hand-welded. The finish was rough, creating unnecessary drag. The pressurization system was primitive, often failing and causing pilots to black out. The advanced targeting system was a copy of a World War II German design. This was the reveal that changed everything. The Soviet Union was not a technological peer. It was a technological parasite. They were building death traps, cutting every safety corner imaginable to achieve raw performance numbers that looked good on paper but were unsustainable in a long war. The mystery of the disappearing radar blips and the high-speed climbs wasn't genius, it was recklessness. The Soviets were pushing their pilots into flight envelopes that were physically suicidal, relying on the bravery of their men to cover the inadequacy of their machines. The impact of this realization on the Soviet high command was devastating. They had assumed their iron curtain of secrecy would hide their industrial weakness forever. Now, the Americans knew. They knew the MiG-15 had a tendency to enter an uncontrollable spin. They knew the engine had a short lifespan. They knew the Giant had clay feet. The Soviet response was desperate and, ultimately, futile. First, they tried to bury the truth. In Poland, Franciszek Jarecki was erased from history. His family was persecuted. The name Jarecki became a curse word in the barracks. The commanders launched a massive purge of the Air Force, grounding units, interrogating pilots, and installing even more draconian political officers in every squadron. They tightened the leash, believing that fear would stop the bleeding. But you cannot intimidate physics, and you cannot terrorize the truth. The futility of their response was exposed just 2 months later. In May 1953, a second Polish pilot, Zdzisław Jasinski, took off in a MiG-15. He didn't care about the purges. He didn't care about the extra guards. He saw what Jarecki had done, and he saw a way out. Jasinski flew the exact same route. He landed on the exact same island, Bornholm. It was a humiliation of biblical proportions. The Soviet lockdown had failed. The superweapon was now being delivered to NATO like a pizza regularly, and while still hot. This second defection proved that the problem wasn't one traitor. The problem was the system. The Soviet pilots knew the truth that the American engineers had just discovered. Their machines were flawed, their leaders were liars, and their lives were expendable. The Kremlin's final desperate move was to accelerate the development of the MiG-17. They rushed to fix the hydraulic lock issues and the high-speed instability found in the MiG-15. They tried to patch the holes that Jarecki had exposed. But it was too late. The mystique was gone. The Americans now flew with a new confidence. They weren't fighting a mythical beast anymore. They were fighting a machine they had taken apart in a Danish hangar. They knew exactly where to hit it. The arrival of Franciszek Jarecki on Bornholm was more than a headline. It was the turning point in the psychological war for the skies. Before March 1953, the MiG-15 was a monster in the closet. After March 1953, it was just a machine with a part number. The verdict of this intelligence coup was written in the skies over Korea in the final months of the war. Armed with the counter-manual, developed by the ATIC engineers, American Sabre pilots changed their tactics. They stopped trying to outclimb the MiG. They knew exactly where the Soviet hydraulic systems would fail. They knew that if they pushed a MiG pilot into a high-speed dive, the laws of physics and the flaws of Soviet manufacturing would do the work for them. The MiG pilot would lock up, unable to pull out, and auger into the ground while the American pulled away. The kill ratio, which had fluctuated wildly during the early years of the war, stabilized firmly in favor of the United Nations forces. While modern historians debate the exact numbers, the trend was undeniable. The paralysis that had gripped Western air power was broken. The US Air Force wasn't just guessing anymore, they were dissecting their opponent in real time. But the legacy of Jarecki's flight extends far beyond the kill counts of the Korean War. It exposed a fundamental rot in the Soviet system that would eventually bring the entire superpower crashing down. The examination of the MiG-15 proved that the Soviet economy was trapped in a cycle of imitation rather than innovation. They could steal a British engine, and they could copy a German gun sight, but they could not replicate the industrial depth required to build them properly. They lacked the precision tooling, the quality control, and most importantly, the culture of safety that defined Western aviation. The killer statistic wasn't a number of planes shot down, it was the number of hours the engine could last. The American engineers found that the Soviet copy of the Nene engine had a service life of barely 100 hours before it needed a complete overhaul. The British and American equivalents could last significantly longer. This meant that for every MiG-15 inches the air, the Soviets needed a massive, inefficient logistical tail to keep it flying. They were burning through their economy just to stay in the air. It was a microcosm of the Cold War itself. The Soviet Union was spending 50% of its GDP to look like a superpower, while the West was spending a fraction of that to actually be one. Jarecki's defection also shattered the myth of the new Soviet man. The Kremlin had spent millions of rubles indoctrinating young men like Jarecki, isolating them from the world, and feeding them propaganda about the evils of the West. They believed they had created a generation of loyal automatons. But when Jarecki landed in Denmark, he didn't ask for a lawyer, he asked for freedom. He showed the world that behind the Iron Curtain, the human spirit hadn't been crushed. It was just waiting for an opening. Franciszek Jarecki eventually made his way to the United States. He was celebrated as a hero, receiving a $50,000 reward, a fortune in 1953, and eventually gaining American citizenship. He met with President Eisenhower. He lived the life he had dreamed of while staring at the grey Baltic ceiling from his cockpit. But the shadow of his flight lingered. The Soviets never fully recovered from the humiliation. They became even more paranoid, locking down their technology and their people even tighter. This paranoia stifled their own scientists, creating a culture where failure was punished as treason. This fear prevented them from fixing the very flaws that Jarecki had exposed, leading to decades of stagnation. In the end, the mystery of the MiG-15 was solved not by a spy satellite or a high-tech listening post, but by the courage of one man who decided he had had enough. Today, if you visit the Polish Aviation Museum in Krakow or the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, you can see these silver arrows. They sit silent now, their engines cold. They are beautiful, terrifying machines. But when you look at them, remember the morning of March 5th, 1953. Remember the moment the radar blip disappeared. That was the moment the West stopped being afraid of the ghost and started winning the war.